Every human being on Earth can trace their ancestry back to Africa. That part you've probably heard. But here's what nobody tells you. The most genetically ancient population alive today isn't scattered across the continent. It's concentrated in one place, one country. And that country also happens to contain people who are more distantly related to other Africans than those other Africans are to Europeans. Read that again. An Ethiopian farmer might share fewer genetic markers with a Kenyan neighbor than that Kenyan shares with someone from Norway. How is that even possible? Let's talk about Ethiopia. When geneticists first started mapping human DNA on a global scale, they expected Africa to be the starting point, the trunk of the tree, with everyone else branching off. And broadly, that's true. Africa has the highest genetic diversity on Earth. But Ethiopia kept throwing up surprises. It didn't fit neatly into any category. Its populations didn't cluster the way researchers expected. Some lineages looked ancient beyond explanation. Others showed signals of migration that pointed in directions that made no geographic sense. Ethiopia, it turned out, wasn't just a chapter in human prehistory. It was an entire library that nobody had fully opened. To understand why Ethiopian DNA is so unusual, you need to understand something about how human genetics actually works. Genetic diversity doesn't mean what most people think it means. It's not about how different people look or how varied their cultures are. It's about the total amount of variation in DNA sequences within a population. And the rule, almost universal, is that the further a population is from Africa, the less genetic diversity it has. Why? Because every time humans migrated to a new place, only a subset of people made the move. They carried a smaller slice of the total genetic pie. And then their descendants moved further, carrying an even smaller slice. Geneticists call this a serial founder effect. By the time you get to the indigenous populations of the Americas or the Pacific, the genetic diversity is quite narrow compared to what exists in Africa. Ethiopia bends this rule until it nearly breaks. The country sits at a geographic crossroads, the Horn of Africa, where the continent almost touches the Arabian Peninsula across a narrow stretch of water. For hundreds of thousands of years, this wasn't just where people lived. It was where they moved through, where populations from different deep lineages occasionally mixed, and where some of the oldest continuous human communities on Earth managed to survive relatively undisturbed. The result is a genetic landscape so layered and complex that researchers have called it, without exaggeration, one of the most important places on Earth for understanding human evolution. Here's the first layer. Ethiopia is home to populations carrying some of the most ancient mitochondrial haplogroups known to science. Mitochondrial DNA is passed exclusively from mother to child, unchanged except for occasional mutations. By tracking these mutations, geneticists can build a family tree of all human maternal lineages. The root of that tree, the lineage from which all others descend, is called haplogroup L. And the deepest, oldest branches of that tree are found not just anywhere in Africa, but with particular concentration in Ethiopia and the surrounding region. The Sandawa and Hadza of Tanzania also carry very ancient lineages, but Ethiopian populations show a striking diversity even among these ancient branches. Some Ethiopian communities carry haplogroup L0, the most basal of all, at frequencies that are extraordinary. This isn't symbolism. This is a direct genetic signal that these communities have been reproducing in or near this region for an extraordinarily long time. But ancient lineages alone don't explain why Ethiopian DNA is so distinctive. The second layer is more complicated and, frankly, more dramatic. Around 50,000 to 70,000 years ago, a group of humans, probably a few thousand individuals at most, left Africa. They crossed, most likely, through the Horn of Africa and into what is now Yemen and the Arabian Peninsula. These were the ancestors of every non-African human alive today. Every single person outside Africa, from the Inuit of northern Canada to the Aboriginal Australians to the Norse to the Han Chinese, descends from that one founding population. And here's the thing that makes Ethiopia so strange. Some Ethiopian populations show a genetic signal that may reflect partial ancestry from groups that returned to Africa after that exodus. not the original migrants who stayed. People who left developed in Eurasia for tens of thousands of years and then came back. This back to Africa migration is one of the most contested and fascinating topics in population genetics. The evidence comes from a signal called Eurasian admixture in East African populations. Genetic variants that are common in Eurasian populations but ancient enough in East Africa that they predate known historical contacts. Some researchers initially thought this was just an artifact, a statistical ghost, but the signal kept showing up in multiple studies using different methods. The leading explanation now is that a Eurasian population, related to ancient populations of the Middle East, migrated back into the Horn of Africa somewhere between 3,000 and 7,000 years ago and mixed with the existing population. Ethiopian populations like the Oromo, the Amhara, and others carry this signal at varying levels. This means that within a single country, you have communities descending from among the oldest human lineages on Earth, layered with genetic contributions from populations that had spent tens of thousands of years evolving outside Africa and then returned. No other population on the planet has this particular combination. Nowhere else do you find such deep, ancient African ancestry sitting alongside Eurasian genetic contributions that predate recorded history, all within a relatively small geographic area. That is why, when researchers run global analyses of human genetic variation, Ethiopian populations routinely appear as outliers. They don't cluster neatly with other sub-Saharan African populations. They don't cluster neatly with North African or Middle Eastern populations. They occupy their own space on the genetic map. Not because they are isolated, but because they are a convergence point for lineages that existed before the very concept of continents meant anything to the humans crossing them. The third layer is more recent, and it explains the extraordinary internal diversity within Ethiopia itself. Ethiopia is not one population. It contains over 80 ethno-linguistic groups, and the genetic differences between some of these groups are striking. The Ari, a population in the southwestern highlands, carry genetic signatures that look different from the Amhara of the central highlands, who look different from the Somali-related groups in the east, who look different from the Nilo-Saharan communities in the west. Some of these differences reflect ancient separations, populations that diverged and lived in relative isolation for thousands of years in different ecological zones, from the highlands above 3,000 meters to the lowland river valleys. Ethiopia's topography is extreme. The Great Rift Valley cuts through the country, creating natural barriers that isolated populations from each other even while they were nominally neighbors. Mountain ranges, river systems, and dramatic elevation changes carved the landscape into genetic compartments. The result is that Ethiopia has within-country genetic diversity that rivals the between-continent diversity you see elsewhere. A study comparing Ethiopian populations to global samples found that some pairs of Ethiopian groups were as genetically distant from each other as Europeans are from East Asians. And yet, they share a country, often share markets, sometimes share languages. The genetic distances aren't about culture or language or visible appearance in any simple way. They're about ancestry, and in Ethiopia, ancestry is a deep, layered, branching thing. Now let's add the fourth layer, because this is where it gets philosophically interesting. The Omo Valley in southern Ethiopia is one of the most important sites in the entire fossil record of human evolution. Human remains found there, dated to approximately 195,000 years ago, what were for a long time considered the oldest, confirmed anatomically modern human fossils ever found came from this region. More recently, fossils from Morocco have been dated even older, but Omo remains one of the crucial data points. The landscape itself is saturated with the physical evidence of human deep time. And the populations living near there today, some of them, the Mursi, the Suri, the Nyangatom, carry genetic signals suggesting extraordinarily long local continuity. Whether the people living near Omo today are literally descended from the people whose bones were found there is not something genetics can confirm. But the deep African haplogroups present in nearby populations are consistent with ancient, continuous presence in that general region. There is something almost disorienting about this. Modern humans being modern humans and simultaneously being among the most ancient continuous populations on Earth. Not ancient in the sense of being primitive, that framing is scientifically illiterate. Ancient in the sense of having the longest unbroken thread connecting them to the humans who first looked up at the stars from that same piece of ground. They didn't move. The rest of us did. Let's come back to that paradox from the beginning, because now we can fully unpack it. How can an Ethiopian be more distantly related to a neighboring African population than that population is to a European? The answer is time plus isolation. The genetic distance between populations grows as a function of how long they've been separated and how little they've mixed since. Some Ethiopian populations have been separated from their African neighbors for so long, tens of thousands of years of relative isolation in different highland or lowland environments, that the genetic gap is genuinely large. Meanwhile, all non-African populations descend from that single out-of-Africa founder group, which means they share a relatively recent common ancestor with each other and with the African populations most closely related to that founder group. The deep internal diversity within Africa, and especially within Ethiopia, creates situations where comparisons between some African populations reveal deeper splits than comparisons between an African population and any given non-African group. This is not an anomaly. This is what genetic diversity looks like when you're standing at the source. There's a medical dimension to this that matters enormously, and it's underfunded and underreported. Because Ethiopian populations have been so underrepresented in global genomic databases, the reference panels used to interpret genetic data for health purposes are badly biased toward European and, to a lesser extent, East Asian populations. When clinicians use these panels to assess disease risk or drug response for Ethiopian patients, the accuracy is lower than it should be. Variants that are common and medically significant in Ethiopian populations may not even be in the database. Research is being done. The Ethiopian Genome Diversity Project and collaborations between local and international researchers are expanding the data, but the gap remains significant. The most genetically diverse region on Earth has, until recently, been among the least studied in terms of clinical genomics. That is a public health problem, not just an academic one. And then there's the linguistic puzzle that genetics can't fully explain but keeps intersecting with. Ethiopian languages span three major families: Afroasiatic, which includes Semitic languages like Amharic and Tigrinya, Cushitic languages like Oromo and Somali, and Omotic languages found only in Ethiopia, which some linguists consider the most divergent branch of Afroasiatic, while others think it may be a separate family altogether. Then there are Nilo-Saharan languages spoken in the West. Four major language families in one country, with the genetic data, partially, but not perfectly tracking the linguistic boundaries. Some populations show genetic evidence of mixture that their languages don't obviously reflect. Some populations that speak related languages show surprisingly deep genetic divergence. The country is a palimpsest, layer written over layer, never fully erasing what came before. Researchers working on the genetics of language spread and the genetics of agriculture's arrival in Africa have repeatedly found Ethiopia to be a critical but complicated case. The spread of Cushitic-speaking pastoralists across the Horn of Africa thousands of years ago left genetic traces. The expansion of Semitic-speaking farmers left different ones. The question of what population was there before all of these movements and what happened to their genetic lineage keeps pulling researchers back to Ethiopia's deepest records. What does all of this mean in the broadest sense? It means that Ethiopia is not a footnote in the story of human genetic history. It is one of the primary texts. The diversity present there, the ancient lineages preserved there, the back migrations that converged there, all of it tells a story about what humanity looked like before geography and distance began pulling populations apart. When you look at an Ethiopian genetics study, you are in some ways looking at a compressed archive of options that the rest of humanity drew from and then narrowed. The rest of the world's gene pool is a subset. The Ethiopian gene pool contains depths that no other single country on Earth can match. That's not a metaphor. That's a result that shows up across independent studies using different methods, run by research teams from different countries. The convergence of findings is what makes Ethiopia so remarkable. Not one paper, not one claim. A growing, consistent body of evidence pointing to the same conclusion that this country, this crossroads, this place where the land almost touches the Arabian Peninsula across a narrow sea, is where the story of being human is most fully told. If you made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person who should be here. There's a lot more to cover: the specific population studies, the clinical genomics picture, the debate over which migration routes the out-of-Africa ancestors actually used, and all of that is coming. If this kind of deep, evidence-based storytelling is what you're looking for, subscribing is the logical next step. And if something here surprised you, challenged something you thought you knew, or raised a question you want answered, leave it in the comments. That's genuinely where some of the best follow-up topics come from. The question you're holding right now might be the one that shapes the next video.